Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for the Outdoor Art Club presentation, Nicotine, Curbing the Youth Nicotine Vaping Epidemic. I'm Robin Geisler, and I'm partnering with fellow OAC Zoom team members, Kate McCormick, Deborah Duck, Jane Stewart, to bring you the program today. Our team is working hard to master the wonderful and exciting world of Zoom, but we are novices, so please be very patient with us. For those of you who are not familiar with the Outdoor Art Club, we're a nonprofit women's organization founded in 1902. We engage in civic, cultural, and charitable work in our community, including presenting public programs like this one in our annual speakers series. Before I turn the program over to today's program chair, please note that if you have any questions about Zoom, you can contact our Able Zoom tech team using the chat function of your screen. If it's easier, you can put your phone number in chat and one of them will call you. And a third option is that you can call them directly. You received several reminder emails for this webinar and their number was included on that. If you have any questions to ask Dr. Prochaska, you can send them anytime during this program by clicking on the Q&A button on your screen. Please note that the Q&A button is different than the chat button. Dr. Prochaska will leave time to address your questions at the end of the program. And at this time, I would like to introduce Mary Herr. Mary is the program chair for today's event. And thank you, Mary.
Hi. Our speaker today is Dr. Jodi Prochaska, a Mill Valley resident. She is a professor in the Department of Medicine at Stanford University with the Stanford Prevention Research Center. She is a member of the Stanford Cancer Institute and faculty director of Stanford's Master of Science program in community health and prevention research. She received her doctorate in clinical psychology and master's degree in public health from the University of California at San Diego and San Diego State University and San Diego State. As a licensed clinical psychologist, Dr. Prochaska is an expert in addiction disorders, and specifically nicotine addiction. She's with us today to help us understand this vaping epidemic in our young people. I'd like to remind you, if you have questions, send them through the Zoom Q&A function. And the question and answer session will begin following the presentation. And now let's welcome Dr. Jodi Prochaska.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Robin, and welcome everyone. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my slides. Great, all right. And let me just get rid of all of that thing. Very good. I'm pleased to be here today to present on youth nicotine vaping in the United States and with a focus more locally. As Mary mentioned, I'm a professor at Stanford where I teach, I conduct research, and provide clinical practice on tobacco and nicotine addiction. I wish that we could connect in person today, though I am grateful for your attention via Zoom. Please submit your questions that come up during my talk, or I think you may be able to upvote questions that interest you. I also am a mom of two, ages 12 and 14, so I come at this topic from a number of angles. My research has been funded by a variety of sources, including the National Institutes of Health, the State of California, and the American Cancer Society. I consult to pharmaceutical and technology companies focused on helping people quit smoking. I have served as an expert witness for plaintiff attorneys in litigation against the tobacco companies, including some cases against Juul, which makes e-cigarettes. I have not taken funding from tobacco or vaping companies. I have been contacted a couple of times and asked to serve as an expert witness for Juul, which I did not pursue. To start, I'd like to mention the creative work of 4 TAM high school students, Courtney, Haley, Natalie, and Sienna, who created a video for a class assignment that they cleverly titled Nicoteen, and I borrowed that title from my own today. Their documentary centers on nicotine vaping among students at TAM and adults in the Bay Area. I was pleased to participate in their film as someone in the field who they interviewed. I posted their YouTube link on a listserv for nicotine researchers, and their reactions are worth mentioning here because they highlight where things are at in the field. One colleague, very outspoken against e-cigarettes, suggested that the film was problematic because he believed most kids will see this film as promoting e-cigarettes as a fun or good idea. I interpret his comments as due to the film showing healthy, cool-looking kids vaping. He has a point, and yet that is the reality of the experience for these students. They interviewed real kids, not models or actors. Another outspoken individual, who is not a scientist, labeled the film as anti-e-cigarette propaganda. And then another individual, Neil Benowitz, who's a physician and scientist at UC San Francisco and a resident of Marin, he responded to me that the documentary was balanced and gave good attention to the different aspects of e-cigarettes, such as uptake by young people and cessation of smoking among adults. Same film, different perspectives. A USA Today reporter wrote an article on the varying and at times polarizing perspectives on e-cigarettes in the field. I was one of the experts interviewed for the piece, with attention to the rigor of scientific methods and reviews that had been conducted. You can see her title here, Is Vaping Safer Than Smoking? Depends who you ask and what scientific study they point to. I raise these 2 examples to point out that different opinions exist in the field regarding e-cigarettes. My intention today is not to persuade you to hold a certain opinion. Rather, I aim to provide a framing on the current state of youth nicotine vaping in our country, reflect on how we got here, and highlight local actions being taken to intervene. So the topics I aim to cover today include the e-cigarette vaping nicotine device landscape, product regulation or lack thereof at the federal, state, and local level, the epidemiology of e-cigarette use among young people and adults, health effects with mention of vaping associated lung injury, VALI, evidence regarding e-cigarettes as a therapeutic, if we have some time for that, and we will close with treatment resources. And then I will open to question and answers. What is an e-cigarette? So e-cigarettes are a continually changing and heterogeneous group of products that are used in a variety of ways. Some terminology is generic, like e-cigarettes, e-hookah, or vapes. Some relate to the type of e-cigarette, like cigalikes, mods, vape pens, tank systems. Some are brand names like Juul, Sorin, Fix, Puff, Puff Bars, Blue. And one is a research term called electronic nicotine delivery systems, or ENDS. At their basics, all e-cigarettes have a battery used to heat up e-liquid that contains nicotine. The battery may be rechargeable. If it's not rechargeable, the device is thrown away once the battery or liquid is expended. Later in the talk, we'll look at the issue of e-cig waste. The e-liquid is heated in the atomizer, which converts the liquid into an inhalable aerosol that brings the nicotine into the tissues of the lungs, crossing into the bloodstream and quickly to the brain. This graphic from the Centers for Disease Control shows the evolution of e-cigarettes over time, starting with the cigalikes in the first generation, then the vape pens, then the mods or tanks, and now in the 4th generation, the pods. Here shown are Juul and Sorin, 2 different brands. The different device types have implications for nicotine delivery and toxin exposure due to the strength of the heating elements. The mods can be adjusted with regard to battery strength and nicotine concentration. The pods use a nicotine salt technology to deliver higher nicotine concentrations, at a lower heating level. We'll touch on a few epidemiologic terms. What do I mean by youth nicotine vaping epidemic? Well, endemic, that relates to a disease or condition that's regularly found, it's constantly present among particular people in a certain area. It'd be considered native, like chickenpox. Epidemic is a sudden and rapid rise of a widespread occurrence of a disease or a condition in a community at a particular time. We see this with the flu. Pandemic, which is what we're experiencing with COVID-19, relates to a disease or condition that's prevalent all over the world. It means all people. Behaviors and policies can prevent diseases or conditions from turning from endemic to epidemics or even pandemics, be it vaccines, travel or mobility or workplace policies, behavioral practices like wearing a mask or sheltering in place. Similarly, with e-cigarettes, there are practices that could have been and now could be put into place to address the youth nicotine vaping epidemic. In 2018, leaders in public health and regulatory policy pronounced youth vaping to have reached epidemic levels in the US. This included the FDA commissioner at the time, Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who's pictured here, and US Surgeon General Dr. Jerome Adams, who's pictured below with my son, who was very taken with this superhero advancing the health of the nation. Well, what was going on in 2018 to declare nicotine youth vaping an epidemic? This graph shows the climb in youth nicotine vaping over time. The data come from the CDC's National Youth Tobacco Survey with surveillance on e-cigarettes starting in 2011. In 2018, 1 in 5 high school students were reporting e-cigarette use in the past month. This is concerning. From 2015 to 2016, 2017, we see a dip in reported e-cigarette use, which could relate to Juul coming onto the market at that time and gaining market share quickly. As we'll see, Juul is marketed as a vaporizer, whereas the CDC survey item related to e-cigarettes and listed brand names other than Juul. This points to the importance of being nimble and responsive with survey surveillance. In 2019, Juul was added to the National Youth Tobacco Survey as a named brand. And 27.5% of high school youth reported past month e-cigarette use. Juul was the brand used most by teens, and about 1 in 9 high school seniors reported vaping nicotine nearly daily. This was 4-fold greater than use by US adults. Clearly a youth phenomenon. Where are we in 2020? I'm glad to say it's coming down. This is a great signal. Though still we see 1 in 5 high school students reporting past 30-day nicotine vaping. Among users, over 80% reported vaping a flavor that other than tobacco, such as mint, fruit, or candy flavored. Also want to mention that the data collection for 2020, which is school-based, was halted early due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it's unclear how that may have affected representativeness of the data. The youth smoking data for 2020 have not yet been released. This slide also shows the past month combustible cigarette smoking among US high school students, which you can see has been on a steady decline. This is good. The concern remains, however, that more youth today are having their brains exposed to nicotine due to e-cigarettes being on the market, and this is a concerning reversal of public health efforts over decades. Another way to examine the rapid rise in e-cigarette use in the US is to examine US sales data. Here shown by e-cigarette brand from 2011 to 2017. Juul came onto the market in mid-2015 and fairly quickly dominated the marketplace. The other players at the time were largely owned by tobacco companies, whereas Juul was created by 2 Stanford graduate students in the design school. Shown here, James Monsees and Adam Bowen. I don't say this with pride for Stanford, simply state it as a fact. Popularity for the brand also can be appreciated from this photo taken by Dr. John Ma, who's a surgeon at Marin General. The photos were taken in May of 2019 at a tobacco shop in Boston. They show the amount of shelf space dedicated to Juul. These data from Nielsen go through the end of 2017. For 2018, Altria boasted that Juul sales had hit $1 billion. We'll look in a moment as to why Altria was the one making this announcement. And if you are unfamiliar with the name Altria, which sounds like altruism, it is the parent company for Philip Morris, which is the company behind Marlboro, the leading brand of cigarettes in the US and globally. So Juul was so successful, in fact, that it is the fastest company to reach decacorn status. This is the term for achieving a $10 billion valuation, which it did in just 7 months after its first venture capital raise. This was 4 times faster than Facebook, and by October 2018, the company was valued at $15 billion. I want to pause here just to emphasize how successful Juul was at this point in October 2018. It was a San Francisco-based company with local investors, and it had real potential to disrupt the combustible tobacco market. But before we look at the current state of affairs, let's look back to see how we got to where we are today. E-cigarettes entered the US market in 2006 and went right to consumers. The public health community became concerned and filed a lawsuit to halt sales until the product went through regulatory review. There had been prior instances with products such as nicotine water or nicotine lollipops that had been pulled from sale. In December 2010, based on the defense's claim that the nicotine in their e-cigarettes was from tobacco plants, and therefore it was a tobacco product and not a drug, the judge ruled that e-cigarettes could remain on the market and only be regulated by the FDA as a tobacco product, unless therapeutic claims are made. We'll return to this point. Note that the nicotine in medications such as nicotine patch or nicotine gum also come from tobacco plants. And yet those products had to go through rigorous clinical trials and gain FDA approval before they could be approved for consumer sales. And initially they were by prescription only. Over 5.5 years later, the FDA at last obtained approvals to regulate e-cigarettes as a tobacco product, and they set forth a plan for review that would effectively leave the current products on the market until 2019. No new or modified products were to enter the marketplace without first getting FDA approval, though we will see this was not well followed or enforced. The 2019 timeline was pushed to 2022 and then pulled back to 2020. A lawsuit was filed against the FDA for inaction in 2018. And finally, less than a month ago, e-cigarette companies had to file with the FDA for what is ironically called a pre-market tobacco product application. Pre-market, though many of the products have at this point been on the market for over 10 years. Returning to the slide, we can see the climb in e-cigarette sales over time, but why this notable jump with Juul? So Juul has several product advantages. First, in its chemistry, it delivers a high concentration of nicotine. Juul's patented nicotine salt technology centers on using benzoic acid to lower the pH and make it easier to inhale high nicotine aerosol into the lungs. A single Juul pod is equal to about 1 pack of cigarettes. And you can purchase 4 Juul pods in a pack that is about the size of a single pack of combustible cigarettes, so it's much more portable. It's also discreet and easy to conceal. The Juul device looks like a flash drive and does not give off a big vape plume or smell like cigarette smoke. Here it's shown tucked into the casing of a Sharpie. Juul started in the US with flavors like mango, cool mint, creme brulee, fruit medley, cool cucumber, menthol, and tobacco flavor. Mango and cool mint in particular were popular among young adolescents. And Juul ignited a strong social media presence with young people. This slide shows the parts of a Juul. The pod at the top holds the nicotine e-liquid, which can vary in flavor. And once depleted, that pod is thrown away. The pod also is the mouthpiece. The longer component that looks like a flash drive holds the battery. It can be recharged via a laptop magnetically connected to its charging docket that goes into a USB port as shown here. This slide shows some research conducted by Juul Labs. It shows the pharmacokinetics of the Juul device in relation to a combustible cigarette. In this case, R.J. Reynolds Pall Mall. You can see that under a regimented 10-puff session or under ad-lib sessions, the Juul device approximates that of a combustible cigarette in terms of speed of nicotine delivery to the blood and to the brain. The graph on the right shows participant reports of different feelings from using the Juul device relative to smoking the Pall Mall. There were no significant differences between the two products and any of the 11 indicators. That is, Juul was rated for satisfaction and ability to reduce cigarette cravings at a level that did not differ significantly from a combustible cigarette. Now, I mentioned the developers of Juul were design students at Stanford. Yet, as can be seen from these industry documents, these are documents that you can search a library of previously secret industry documents online, and that library is held by the University of California, San Francisco. These industry documents were influential in guiding Juul's development, both in terms of it being a vaporizer and also in terms of its nicotine salt technology. And these documents date back 4 decades prior, and they come from Reynolds' laboratories. This first is the nicotine salt from the late 70s, and then this in relation to having it be something that's, you create an aerosol rather than a smoke to transfer the nicotine to the lung and to the brain. The next few slides show Juul's social media campaign from 2015. These slides are credited to Robert Jackler's group at Stanford. You'll see, they're exciting, they're colorful, they're youthful. On this one, there's not even an indication of what that device actually is. This was their vaporized ad campaign. So again, it wasn't really labeled as an e-cigarette, more as a vaporizer. And as I discussed, its nicotine salt technology was delivering a high level of nicotine. And there's no indication of the addictive nature of this product at this time. Here you can see the similarities of styling of the Juul model with Ariana Grande, a pop music celebrity popular among teens. Juul was featured in prime locations such as New York City's Times Square. There were Juul parties held in major US cities with free Juul samples provided. There were posts to Juul's social media account that included such images as Katy Perry with her Juul at the Golden Globes. And then here are examples of the types of videos that proliferated on the social media site YouTube and hashtags that were used by Juul in online marketing messages through October of 2018. Though to be fair, this vaping hoodie YouTube video that I found, it was not with a Juul device. And see how it's got nearly 4 million viewers or views. Here are some examples of memes and images that were posted to hashtag Juul. The image here shows girls making the Juul name with their hands. Social media influencers who appeal to young people were paid to promote the product. And the imagery here connects to ad campaigns of traditional tobacco companies, here with Camel. Similarly, here with a focus on socializing, Juul ads incorporated the advertising styles of traditional tobacco companies. And here, healthy, attractive women with messaging centering on new innovations and evolutions, the Juul today, the miracle tip filter in the past. Notably, filtered cigarettes conferred no true harm reduction to the smoker over unfiltered cigarettes. Celebrating national holidays, celebrating mom and dad. And then eventually a pendulum swing by Juul in 2018, now featuring Gloria, the 80-year-old former smoker who has switched to Juul. Mind you, switch sounds like quitting, which suggests a therapeutic, which by 2018, Juul and no other e-cigarette company had bothered to test and demonstrate to the FDA for regulatory approval of a therapeutic claim. So what's the implications of these campaigns? Well, tobacco product promotions remain ubiquitous. My group conducted a survey of over 1,000 teens across the United States, and nearly all had seen cigarette and e-cigarette product promotions in the past month. Most were at point of sale in the store and on major and social media. We found that greater exposure to tobacco product promotions was associated with ever and current smoking, as well as ever and current e-cigarette use. Among never users of tobacco products, greater exposure to tobacco product promotions was associated with susceptibility to vape, saying, oh, maybe I would consider that. Family and peer use and attitudes also were significant correlates, and it should be noted that those individuals are likely to share the same marketing exposures as the young people. The photo I include here is of my daughter about 4 years ago walking out of the 7-Eleven in Strawberry in Mill Valley. Before she's able to leave the store, she's exposed there to ads for American Spirit in the bottom left, Enjoy e-cigarettes, and Swisher Sweets on the right, which are flavored cigars attractive to youth. All right, back to Juul advertising. This one certainly made a strong claim. Fact, Juul Labs is not big tobacco. And if we return again briefly to the sales figures, I want to point out that the e-cig brands in the bracket there were all held by tobacco companies. Vuse, which we'll return to later, was in the lead, held by British American Tobacco, which is Reynolds. Mark 10 and Green, held by Altria, which is Philip Morris, weren't doing that well. Oh, let's see. Okay, so in October of 2018, Altria pulls their pod-based e-cigarettes, the Mark 10 and Green Smoke. The reason given is that Altria views the pod and flavored products to be driving the increase in use by young people. Further, Altria's VP of Regulatory Affairs states that the company wants to be part of the solution on youth vaping and not risk being a contributor to the problem. Remember, Juul Labs is not big tobacco. Yet Murillo is now the Chief Regulatory Officer at Juul Labs, and his boss, Juul CEO, was Altria's Chief Growth Officer, and prior to that, President and CEO of Philip Morris USA, maker of the Marlboro Man. How did that happen? In December of 2018, Altria took a 35% stake in Juul for $12.8 billion, valuing the company at $38 billion. The deal was said to have ended 14 months of negotiations, which certainly predates the earlier statements that Altria was dropping its pod products to not contribute to the youth nicotine epidemic. Commissioner Gottlieb left his post announcing he was going to spend more time with his family. The partnership brings together the leading youth initiation products for cigarettes and e-cigarettes. Note the similarities. It's probably not accidental. Another example here. The e-cigarette market was estimated at $9 billion in the US for 2019 and at $12.4 billion globally. Okay, now e-cigarettes are but one type of tobacco product. There's a long list here. All share the commonality of delivering nicotine to the brain, though with different mechanisms and different speeds of delivery. Let's turn to nicotine. Nicotine, like other drugs such as cocaine, heroin, and amphetamine, exerts profound effects on the brain. These agents have in common the ability to stimulate the release of neurotransmitter dopamine in the midbrain. Dopamine induces feelings of euphoria and pleasure and is responsible for activating the dopamine reward pathway. The dopamine reward pathway, as depicted in this simplified diagram, is a network of nervous tissue in the middle of the brain that elicits feelings of pleasure in response to certain stimuli. The important interconnected structures of the reward pathway include the ventral tegmental area, or VTA, the nucleus accumbens, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the area of the brain responsible for thinking and judgment. The neurons of the VTA contain the neurotransmitter dopamine, which is released in the nucleus accumbens and in the prefrontal cortex. Behaviors that naturally stimulate the reward pathway include eating to relieve hunger, drinking to alleviate thirst, or engaging in sexual activity. On a primitive neurochemical level, stimulation of the reward pathway reinforces the behavior so that it will be repeated. Obviously, these behaviors are necessary for continued survival of the organism. The reward pathway can also be stimulated by drugs of abuse, such as cocaine, opiates, amphetamine, and nicotine. When these unnatural stimuli trigger the reward pathway, the same pleasurable feelings are elicited. Researchers believe that with chronic drug use, the brain becomes chemically altered, transforming a drug user into someone's addicted to the drug. concerning cigarette smoking, immediately following inhalation, a bolus of nicotine enters the brain and binds to acetylcholine receptors. Binding to these receptors, nicotine stimulates the release of dopamine, which induces nearly immediate feelings of pleasure and relief of symptoms of nicotine withdrawal. Repeated exposure to nicotine in the brain leads to an upregulation, that is, an increase in the number of acetylcholine receptors in the brain. Nicotine's effects do not last very long in the brain, and when it leaves the receptors, symptoms of nicotine withdrawal occur. This rapid dose response of stimulating the receptors, releasing dopamine, and alleviating nicotine withdrawal reinforces and perpetuates the smoking behavior. On a neurochemical level, nicotine induces a variety of central nervous system effects, cardiovascular and metabolic effects as well. Nicotine stimulates the release of many neurotransmitters, which have been associated with the following effects. As we mentioned, dopamine, but also norepinephrine, acetylcholine, glutamate, endorphin, GABA, and serotonin, having effects of increasing feelings of pleasure, relaxation, cognitive enhancement. And these all sound appealing. However, again, nicotine's effects are short-lived. And when nicotine is discontinued abruptly, the following withdrawal symptoms develop, including depression, insomnia, irritability, anxiety, difficulty concentrating, restlessness, increased appetite or weight gain, decreased heart rate, and cravings. In general, these withdrawal symptoms peak within 24 to 48 hours after cessation, and they gradually dissipate over the next 2 to 4 weeks. However, strong cravings for nicotine may persist for months to years after cessation. Although not life-threatening in their own right, nicotine withdrawal effects contribute to morbidity and mortality because they promote continuous and prolonged daily and often heavy tobacco use that leads to disease and death. I think I might skip this one just so we can make sure we stay on time. What is addiction? It's compulsive drug use without medical purpose in the face of negative consequences. And nicotine use can meet this definition. That's the science that I've covered, but what did the tobacco industry know about nicotine's effects and addiction? Previously, secret tobacco industry documents reveal extensive internal knowledge of nicotine's addictive effects, which were denied to the public for decades. The photo on the right is from the 1994 Waxman congressional hearings, during which the executives from each of the 7 major US tobacco companies stood and affirmed that they did not believe nicotine in cigarettes to be addictive. The quotes, in contrast, are from the 1960s through early 1990s. These are from previously secret tobacco industry documents, each affirming nicotine to be addictive and at the center of the tobacco industry's business model. The quote I highlighted from 1978 speaks to the conundrum with nicotine vaping. While it may be safer than cigarettes, it may also increase the number of people who become addicted to nicotine. In 2017, more than 11 years after being ordered by the court, the tobacco companies released corrective statements to tell the truth to the American public about the harms of smoking and the addictive nature of cigarettes. I show one of the statements here with the text that was fought over for over a decade, including the industry's insistence on deleting the phrase, "Here is the truth." Affirmed is that smoking is highly addictive. Nicotine is the addictive drug in tobacco, and cigarette companies intentionally designed cigarettes with enough nicotine to create and sustain addiction. Now, it's not just the drug, but the speed with which that drug reaches the brain that impacts its addictive potential. The slide here shows the speed at which nicotine in a cigarette versus pharmaceutical nicotine replacement products delivers nicotine into the blood and into the brain. None of the medications come close to the spike seen that you see with cigarettes. The bottom line there with the navy color blue shows the slow and steady delivery that you get with a nicotine patch. In my experience, no one becomes addicted to the transdermal nicotine patch. Recall Juul's research that we examined earlier with the pharmacokinetic curve for Juul approximating that of a combustible cigarette. What about the flavors? The tobacco companies have similarly known for decades that to attract replacement smokers, which is how they have referred to young people, use of sweet flavors are attractive and make it easier for the smoke to be taken in and for young people to become hooked to the nicotine. What are the health consequences? Well, for combustible cigarette, the health harms are well known. The 2014 Surgeon General's report identified the following long list of diseases with sufficient evidence to infer a causal relationship with smoking. Tobacco use negatively impacts virtually every organ system of the body. Today, about 34 million US adults smoke cigarettes. Smoking remains the leading preventable cause of death in the US. It accounts for nearly 500,000 deaths in the US each year, or nearly 1 in 5. For every person who dies from smoking, at least 30 people live with serious smoking-related illness. And smoking-related death and disease costs the US over $300 billion annually. How about e-cigarettes? Okay, well, so few things, if anything, are going to be as harmful as cigarettes. With e-cigarettes, the aerosol, it often contains nicotine, even if it's marketed as 0% nicotine, because the products have not been well regulated. Juul, for example, does not have a zero nicotine pod. E-cig aerosol may contain ultrafine particles that can be inhaled deep into the lungs. There are chemicals used for flavorings that are cytotoxic, that is deadly, harmful to the cells, especially mint, the creamy flavors, and cinnamon. There are volatile organic compounds, cancer-causing chemicals, and heavy metals such as nickel, tin, and lead. Now, all of these, though, at lower levels than you see in combusted tobacco smoke. In terms of the long-term effects of e-cigarette use, they're still unknown. This is because the devices have been on the market only since 2006. They have changed over time, and so we still, need more time to see what effects will be in the long term. There are indications of more acute effects, such as chronic cough, bronchitis, and asthma, injury to the small airways of the lungs, inflammatory respiratory diseases, impaired immune cell function in lungs. And then the concerns on the right are more exploratory. The first one there is a single study that found cancer development on mice. However, it should be noted that it had a very long period of exposure when extrapolated to humans. I'll pause for one slide on VALI, which is vaping-associated lung injury. The clinical presentation is a diagnosis of exclusion, and I've listed the symptoms there. Some patients have been put on iron lung machines because in order to stay breathing, and there have been fatalities. According to the CDC, as of February 2020, there have been over 2,800 hospitalizations and 68 deaths nationally due to VALI. And the CDC's guidelines point largely to vaping of THC liquid cannabis as the cause, and in particular, THC liquids that contain vitamin E acetate. So while serious, the data are still largely emerging, they largely seem to be pointing to cannabis vaping, and again, when the cannabis liquid is cut with vitamin E acetate. So do avoid that. Juul has cataloged specific complaints to them. These are from 2015 to 2018, summarized here. 2,600 complaints of adverse health effects, and 156,000 complaints of nicotine liquid leaking from the Juul pod into the user's mouths. So in terms of a population net risk benefit, and this is precisely what the FDA is considering in the pre-market tobacco product application submitted for review less than a month ago. It is not yet proven or FDA approved, but switching completely from combustible cigarettes to e-cigarettes should equate with lower toxin exposures. If the individual uses both products, which many adult smokers do, termed dual users, that does not seem to confer any health benefit. Earlier exposure to nicotine on the developing brain is associated with heavier long-term addictive use based on cigarette smoking data, and it's very, very likely to be the same for e-cigarettes. And then prospective data, so studies that follow young people over time, indicate that youth e-cigarette use is associated with trial and continued combustible cigarette smoking. I put an asterisk here because though observed in prospective studies, it does not seem to bear out in the epidemiologic data. Recall this slide where we see e-cigarette use going up over time and combustible cigarette use continuing to trend downward. Here I'll share some data from a study I was involved in where we surveyed a sample of 173 adolescents in the Bay Area over a 12-month period. At study start, all reported using an e-cigarette at least once in the past month and at least 10 times in their life. We were interested in seeing whether their e-cigarette use changed over time. Was it an experimental phase? Did it remain stable, or did it increase over time? Over the 12 months of the study, we found that 80% continued to use their e-cigarettes. Daily use increased from 14.5% at baseline to 18% at 6 months and up to 30% at 12 months. Measures of nicotine dependence got higher, that is worse. Measures of cotinine in their urine, which is the largest metabolite of nicotine, got higher over time, indicating greater nicotine exposure. And more kids graduated up to Juul-type devices over time, nearly half at 12 months follow-up. So here in a prospective one-year study that included biochemical verification, we saw evidence of increasing more dependent use with graduation to Juul-type devices in an adolescent sample. What are the reasons that youth and adults give for using e-cigarettes? The flavors among young people, particularly the young people. Adults perceiving them as less harmful than cigarettes and that they may facilitate quitting. Why would adults think that they would help with quitting? Again, the marketing has suggested that. Here, the slide shows the strategies reported by adults in the US and their attempts to quit. The data are from 2014 to 2016. Most attempts are unaided. Attempts to switch to other tobacco products are common, and few use evidence-based treatments. I'm going to skip a little bit, noticing time, but early study that suggested e-cigarettes were as good as patches in quitting. Really, next to nobody quit in that study. This was in New Zealand, published in Lancet. And as a US investigator, my hands are tied. I cannot conduct therapeutic studies of e-cigarettes because the companies have not gone for that approval through the FDA. I do want to mention this study. It comes from the UK. They found that the e-cigarette outperformed nicotine replacement therapy. However, at 1 year follow-up, those who had quit smoking, 80% of those in the e-cigarette group were still using their e-cigarette. And so it's important to let patients know that if they switch to e-cigarettes, they may be transferring their addiction from one product, combustibles, to another, which is e-cigarettes. And in my clinical work at Stanford, I have worked with patients who successfully quit smoking with Juul and then found themselves addicted to the Juul. And we worked to get them off the Juul because they were bothered by it. But a sentiment that was expressed is that they wish they hadn't gone to the Juul because it just delayed their quitting process and essentially led to them having to quit twice. The Surgeon General report came out in 2020. It's focused on smoking cessation. Some of the conclusions on e-cigarettes are that they are continually changing and heterogeneous group of products used in a variety of ways. The FDA has not approved e-cigs as a quit smoking aid, and people who smoke should talk to their doctor about proven methods to quit. Recall this timeline. People got frustrated, and California is known for its innovative public health policies. So what was referred to as the Mad San Fran vape ban made it illegal to sell any e-cigarette that had not been FDA approved. So it didn't say you can't ever have an e-cig, it just said you have to go through that FDA process that's been held up for years. This passed in June of 2019, and it took effect in January of this year. Proposition C sought to stop it, and it was funded heavily by Juul at an estimated $18 million. And you can see the vote was 81% to turn down Prop C. FDA came out to make a ruling to stop pod flavored cartridge-based e-cigarettes like Juul. It doesn't hit all flavors, it doesn't hit menthol, it doesn't hit all product types, as we'll see, and doesn't address flavored cigars. But this did take effect in February of this year. It left open a hole for this product called Puff Bars, which filled some of the void from Juul. And you can see some TikTok videos of young people sharing their use of Puff Bars. Reynolds also has done well with the FDA's focus on Juul type devices, and its views is regaining market share and doing the same kind of social media marketing strategies that Juul had done. And interestingly, that Reynolds had blamed Juul for in the past. The Views sales rose 83% in July of this year compared to the year prior. California's flavored tobacco ban recently passed, and it would ban all flavored tobacco products across the state, with the exception for premium cigars and hookah. And there was, however, a referendum filed by the tobacco company interest groups, which may put a halt to this for some time. Coming up on time, I just want to put a shout out to Dr. Jeremiah Mock, who's done some really innovative garbology studies locally. He's an anthropologist at UC San Francisco. These are pod caps from Juul that he found on the schoolyards in local Marin schools. He also found cigar wrappers. This is Redwood School, and each little red spot there shows you where tobacco-related materials, refuse, was found around the school. They brought these data, literally the garbage you can see in the hand of Jeremiah Mock there, to the County of Marin supervisors, Board of Supervisors, and they passed a flavor ban. I want to give a shout out to Mill Valley's local flavor tobacco product ban that was passed in September, and it's going forward for enactment. And it specifically prohibits the sale of, so it's not that you're going to arrest a young kid for smoking, but you're going to stop the sales at the site of the retailer. All right, I'm going to pass this over to questions with Mary, because I think we've seen enough, but I will, resources here, smokefree.gov is excellent. The Quit Line offers cessation counseling for e-cigs. There's some texting programs. And if you're interested in advocacy efforts, nationally, Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids is very focused on this issue. And smokefreemarin.com is the website for Smoke Free Marin, very focused locally. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Prochaska. Quite interesting and depressing, frankly. But we do have a number of questions. I'd like to begin with the first one is, why don't we call this problem pandemic? Is it a financial difference or cultural difference in different countries?
Great question. So there are different policies in different nations, and some have outwardly banned e-cigarettes, like Japan, New Zealand, and Australia have had very strict restrictions on nicotine in e-cigarette devices. So different countries have taken different policy approaches. Also, we don't have super surveillance data across the globe. So there are some studies showing some very high rates of e-cigarette use among youth in Poland, for example, but we don't have it for all countries.
Tobacco is the #1 cause of preventable disease, disability, and death in the US. How do we go about implementing behavioral changes in middle and high school students who are so influenced by their peers?
Yeah, very nice. So you can focus on prevention, you can focus on cessation. Ideally, you're going to get in early and focus on prevention. Efforts along those lines have helped young people become aware of marketing techniques that are targeted at them, might even have young people develop counter marketing techniques, and kind of revealing the industry's desires to target young people to make their market, their sales off of young people and the harms over time. So ideally, you are going to work with young people before they start to use the products. And then policies are a huge piece, not allowing any tobacco use, certainly on schools, but also not allowing retailers near schools, not having advertising for these products near schools, impacting social media and not allowing influencers to be paid by tobacco industry to push the product among their young followers.
Do they talk about this in the schools? Do they, in the middle school, for instance?
They do. So my son goes to school locally, and you need to have a balance there. There can be at times kind of this vilification, over dramatization, hyperbole around it. So to say all kids will get addicted and all kids, their lungs will fall apart. Like you don't want to take it so far that the kids don't believe you as an authority figure. So there is some, and at times I do worry that it might go a little too far.
You mentioned that the Marin cities, actually I think most of the Marin cities have outlawed flavored tobacco products, and the statewide ban is supposed to go into effect January 1st. What impact do you feel this law will have on our children's use of vaping?
I think it'll have a big impact, and not just on our kids, but also as a model for the country. It's the flavors that makes it easy, as they say, for the poison to go down. And there are so many flavors out there that are attractive to kids. I didn't go into like the unicorn vomit or the Katy Perry cherry and such. And then also not just the e-cigs, but the cigars. E-cigarette use has been largely more affluent, more educated, more Caucasian issue, and just equally as important is the issue of cigars that are sold in single or 2 to a pack, very cheaply flavored, that have targeted minority communities.
Are there any medications that help young people quit vaping?
Yeah, so the FDA put out a public hearing, and I'll share a slide here, calling for investigators to come up with a drug to address the issue. And there's not yet been a drug that's effective to help young people quit smoking. So part of my frustration is, why would we think that there would be something for quitting vaping? An article that I'm a co-author on, that we just published in Lancet Child and Adolescent Health, it was funded by Pfizer, so it's funded by pharma, and it was a null study. We didn't find an effect for varenicline, Chantix, with adolescent smokers. So, I've seen in the literature, or in the news media, rather, that some places are trying nicotine gum as a way to address it, but we don't have data to show a strong efficacy for use of medications with helping adolescents get off nicotine. And again, that's why I would really emphasize policy interventions to prevent the promotion and ease of access to young people.
And how are the kids getting these things?
Yeah, so a variety of ways, but I'll share 2 examples as well there, if I may. One, retail. So you would think that young people are getting carded because they have to be, used to be 18, now nationally it's 21, but let's see, yeah. And then, but in fact, the kids were able to get at retail here. Walgreens was pointed out as being particularly egregious, as well as Circle K. You can see 18% of Walmart stores were selling to young people or violated when they were tested by the FDA. So some of it certainly at retail. Also with Juul was selling their product online, and some investigations showed that they were selling it to young people and to some people with very bogus names like Beer Can. And I'll show you this. I was intrigued by it because Juul then put on a more stringent way to verify your age. And so I went in to do that to see if they would block me. And it was the kind of questions like, which street have you lived on, and such. And I purposely failed it to see what they would do with me. And what they did, this was on 4/8/18, 4 days later, even though I failed their age verification, they started sending me ads. This one I liked, pretty blush gold device. Another one the next month, another one to start their mango kit before it's gone, you get a discount. And it's not that I had gone back and verified my age properly, because here, let's see if I can see the date. They were still coming after me and saying, "How come on, verify your age." It was in August.
Oh. What is it that the kids like about these e-cigarettes? What does it do for them? Does it get them high? Are they trying to get high?
Yeah, it's a quick, easy way to get the feel-good chemical dopamine released.
Yeah.
And you can dose it as you like. You don't get intoxicated, so you can still stay in school, drive a car and whatnot. But you do get the light up of the brain, the feel-good hormone chemicals of dopamine. It tastes good. It's got a neat flavor. It can be social. And then those positive aspects that get you drawn in, then that's positive reinforcement. Then you get the flip side. Those things don't last very long. And when the nicotine's gone from the brain, you've got that upregulation of nicotinic receptors. They're hungry, and you get the withdrawal. You get the irritability, the agitation, the anxiousness. And so then you're reaching for that jewel again. That's negative reinforcement, where you're using the drug not to feel good, but to avoid feeling badly.
Are there nicotine receptors already in the brain naturally? If so, how are they normally stimulated?
Yeah. So they're truly called acetylcholine receptors. And when I became a student in this area, everybody calls them nicotinic receptors because nicotine binds to the acetylcholine receptors. It's not that our brains are built to take on nicotine. They are built to take on acetylcholine, which then causes that cascade of feel-good hormones. It's just that nicotine is able to get in there and act like a key on that lock and cause the same effects.
Can you share any legal experience related to e-cigarettes?
The cases with e-cigarettes are really new and currently underway, so nothing much to mention there. There's a lot of them. There's thousands, I understand, lawsuits against Juul specifically, be it individuals, be it state attorney generals. So there's definitely a lot of concern about that company specifically. There also is concern around puff bars, although it's harder to track down where those were coming from. And my understanding is, and this is all public information, that even Tam High School is involved in litigation now, it sounds like, against Juul.
Has this Zoom schooling impacted youth use of e-cigarettes? Are they doing more of it now? Because they're always at home.
Oh, now that they're home?
Yeah.
Got it. We don't know. We will not know until we get more surveillance data. And typical surveillance data is done in the schools. So
yeah,
I don't know what the plan is.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do you convince your teen not to do this?
They hear about, be it patients or different, individuals not identifying information, but certainly they hear about experiences of people having challenges quitting, and what can seem like a cool, fun thing to do initially can become something that you feel trapped and cannot stop. So they are well informed. They're curious themselves. It's not that they're going to necessarily just take my advice, but they certainly seek out information elsewhere as well.
If you have a child that you think is addicted to e-cigarettes, what are some effective ways to get them to stop?
Yeah, I would try to open the conversation. So not judgmental, not threatening, but just try to understand what's going on, and open-ended questions. If they haven't shared it with you, you could ask, what are their friends doing? Do they see friends doing it? Typically what their friends are doing might come close to what they're experiencing. asking them what are the good things they get out of it, and then what are the things that they're concerned about with it, and try to address that balance sheet, the pros and cons. You want to raise the pros ultimately of quitting, and to help them move towards that. But yeah, definitely opening the conversation, also looking at their beliefs and their ability to make this change, and working with them on strategies to manage their mood in healthier ways rather than dosing it with nicotine. Exercise, deep breathing, engaging in pleasant activities is what I'd recommend.
One of our listeners or viewers was wondering if there have been any success stories in cracking down on person-to-person sales to minors. Both of his children have admitted they can obtain vaping pens from dealers on Snapchat. Yet our local police suggest they have no means to enforce the laws in these areas.
Yeah, interesting. I try to go at the top of that stream, kind of the source. I hear what they're saying. At one point, the person who was head of legal at Juul, Ashley Gould, was reaching out to different people in public health and asking what could they do differently. And I asked along the lines of that question, here you have all this refuse in the schools, you have the product, they have serial numbers on it. Why doesn't Juul track down those distribution chains and shut them down? But yeah, I don't know how you stop virtual sales. The San Francisco made a rule that not only can you not buy flavored tobacco in the city, but you can't ship it to the city either. So you might have more recourse if you were in a city that had that. I'm sorry. Mary, I do see we're at time, and I know if you have other aspects, but I've absolutely enjoyed presenting to you all. Thank you for your questions. If you ever have further questions, feel free to reach out to me. And I think the world of the Outdoor Art Club. My mom is a member, and I am so appreciative of the civic work that you do for our community. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Doctor. It's really been a lot of information, and I learned a lot. And I fear for my grandchildren. But thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So the next speaker event that the Outdoor Art Club is presenting will be on Thursday, November 5th. The topic is Making Magic from Broadway to Berkeley. The speaker is Joanna Felser, former artistic director of New York Stage and Film, and current artistic director of Berkeley Repertory Theater. She'll talk about her life and work in American musical theater, especially her connection with Hamilton. If you'd like to attend or view that webinar, come to the Outdoor Art Club website under public events and register. You can also add your name to our mailing list on the public events page so that you'll be informed of all our future programs. We hope to see you again soon.